Hello, hello, and welcome. Good morning from New York. Hello, all over the world. Thank you very much for joining us today. Dear friends and colleagues, all people with a heart for development, welcome to the 2021 commemoration of the International Day for the Eradication of Poverty. Today, people experiencing extreme poverty break the silence of poverty. They speak out against the pain of exclusion, discrimination, injustice, and violence. Today, we honor their courage, their resilience, and we join hands with the most vulnerable and the farthest behind. We pledge our commitment to end persistent poverty, respecting all people and our planet. There remains a lot to be somber about, given our context amidst a gruesome pandemic that continues to dig deeper holes into extreme poverty. And yet, we must reject despair. So today is also about solidarity. Today is about hope. My name is Joy Kategekwa. I'm from Uganda, that beautiful pearl of Africa. And at UNDP, together with a team of spirited professionals, we work every day in 170 nations across the world with a stubborn yet essential philosophy that it is possible to defeat poverty. I know with you today, we are birds of a feather. And I thank you for making the choice to be with us today. Thank you to our co-organizers, ATD, Fourth World, DESA, the Permanent Mission of France, and the Permanent Mission of Burkina Faso to the United Nations, the International Committee for October 17, the UN NGO Committee for Social Development, and UNDP. I also extend a special welcome to all of you, the over 1,000 participants on this virtual commemoration. On this day of the eradication of poverty, we will hear from America, we will hear from Brazil, we'll hear from France, and we'll hear from Africa. In this range, we're reminded of the universality of the question of poverty, and yet also its differentiated contexts. So let us kick off with a video capturing the spirit of this International Day for the Eradication of Poverty. Join me as we delve into the spirit of this incredibly important day.
"21 years ago, I helped to organize my first October 17 commemoration here at the United Nations. Today is special to me because it brought together people from all walks of life to recommit to fight poverty everywhere and to honor the lives of people who died because of poverty.
It's important that we stand up for our rights, that we voice our needs, make noise to get what we have the right to have.
Le 17 octobre, c'est notre journée. C'est un moment de gloire pour dire le courage des personnes. C'est dire aussi l'inacceptable, que la misère et la pauvreté est une tragédie.
The 17th October is a day we work gathered together, and we work with allies, with activists,
avec les militants, avec des dignitaires,
and with leaders so that we
se
can be
faire
heard.
entendre.
Honor y un gran privilegio de parte primeramente de Dios y del gobierno que da para poder cambiar el 17 de octubre la Rosa de la Paz, que es una bendición. Ahí se representa a cada familia pobre y humilde que vive aquí en Guatemala y alrededor de todo el mundo. Y Dios los bendiga.
Le 17 octobre, on partage nos idées, nos expériences. Ce qu'on peut faire pour faire disparaître la misère. Ce jour-là, on parle devant les autorités et nous écoutent. C'est en écoutant les unes et les autres qu'on peut changer le monde.
In the same spirit, we are gathered here today not only to pay tribute to the victims of extreme poverty, but to hear their voice and their message, because you are key partners for peace, for the development, and for the human rights and dignity.
We must do more to listen to them, address the indignities they face, and tackle the power structures that prevent their inclusion in society.
Because you heard from adults, you have probably never heard from kids. You need to hear what we as kids think about what is going on and to take it seriously. Thank you for listening to us.
We must work together towards achieving the eradication of poverty and leaving no one behind.
The day is also special to me because it embodies the spirit of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that everybody deserves dignity and respect.
On this International Day for the Eradication of Poverty, let's get together to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals for a world where everyone thrives in peace, dignity, and equality on a healthy planet.
What a contextualization. We must listen, we must honor their courage. It's about the rights of everybody. It's about dignity. Every year, the International Day has a major theme, and this year's theme is Building Forward Together, Ending Persistent Poverty, Respecting All People and Our Planet. To open our event and reflect on this International Day's major theme, it is my pleasure to invite Mr. Achim Steiner, Administrator of the United Nations Development Program. Mr. Steiner, welcome, and thank you very much for joining us. How can we build forward together to end persistent poverty, respecting all people and our planet? The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Joy. And indeed, you come from a wonderful place. So Havare Asabui to you. And I've just been watching our chat box, and I want to greet all our friends and colleagues from all over the world. What an amazing array of messages that are appearing in the chat box. And to welcome you all to what is, as you have just said, Joy, and we saw also in the words of those who spoke to this idea of an International Day for the Eradication of Poverty. It is a great privilege to open this event to mark this International Day for the Eradication of Poverty. And let me immediately say, you know, in the United Nations, we have many days during the calendar year when we elevate a particular theme or issue in order to give it further exposure. It doesn't mean that on the other 364 days of the year, we somehow do not think about it. And certainly when it comes to the eradication of poverty, I think we all know that we have a long way to go. Indeed, over the last year and a half, that way to go has become longer and for many more arduous. For many of you joining us today, and for those currently living or directly affected by poverty, perhaps also through this pandemic, poverty is not a statistic. It is something very real. It is something very personal. This occasion is perhaps like no other before it, because humanity is now at a crossroads. Human choices shaped by values and institutions have given rise to the interconnected planetary and social imbalances we face. Inequality, poverty, injustice, unfairness, they intersect. And in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, extreme poverty is rising for the first time in a generation. Remarkably, 100 million people were pushed into poverty in 2020, and who knows if that number even captures the true reality. Yet, beyond income, people experience poverty in multiple and simultaneous ways in their daily lives. 1 in 3 children globally missed out on remote learning when COVID-19 shuttered schools, for instance. And also a drastic reminder for all those kids who, even before the pandemic, were actually not attending school. And entire sections of society were disproportionately affected by the pandemic. It was a great revealer. Consider, for instance, the 1.6 billion informal workers globally, from street vendors and domestic workers to subsistence farmers. They work in vulnerable employment with limited or no social protection at all, and on low wages, often in unsafe conditions. And indeed, women constitute most of these workers. As the pandemic hit, millions of people lost their jobs and livelihoods, sometimes literally overnight. Indeed, instability and conflict also continue to threaten the rapidly tip millions more of people into poverty. By mid-2022, for example, Afghanistan could face near universal poverty, with 97% of the population living below the poverty line. Imagine that for a moment and what it means to live in a nation called Afghanistan at this moment. And by 2030, fragile settings will be the home to 2/3 of the world's population living in extreme poverty. Testimony also to this extraordinary capacity of humans to engage not with one another in solidarity, but against each other in conflict. Right now, the disparities in vaccine distribution worldwide are starting to create a two-track recovery among countries. In high-income countries, nearly 61% of people have now been vaccinated with at least one dose of the vaccine. That figure is less than 4% in low-income countries. This situation is helping to ferment an even more unequal economy and economic recovery. Indeed, the long-term socioeconomic impacts of COVID-19 will continue to hit poor countries and people living in poverty the hardest, unless we correct course now. And it always bears repeating. These are choices we make, and choices matter. Therefore, the United Nations, led by the World Health Organization, is currently trying to help the world to make the right choice by driving forward efforts to ensure that everyone can access life-saving vaccines, the fastest way to finally bring this pandemic under control. And we do need to work together in solidarity to ensure that people living in poverty do not simply return to the world that they had before. They are calling on us to build forward together. To do that, we must shift our priorities if we want humanity and Earth to survive and thrive. We must rethink a world that continues to spend $500 billion each year on fossil fuel subsidies that are destroying our planet and fueling the climate crisis, while hundreds of millions of people continue to live in poverty. Indeed, it is in some instances even driving greater poverty. And we must remind ourselves that 70% of the people living in poverty depend on natural resources for all or part of their livelihoods. Yet, our planet's ecosystems and biodiversity are in a precipitous decline. Understanding, for example, a concept like GDP, which is so often invoked in terms of national policy, that gross domestic product and growing our economies, begins to look completely different if you actually take the GDP of the poor and begin to understand what their economy is made up of, leading to very different policy choices. 2 billion people who depend on farms for their livelihoods are at risk of falling into poverty because of biodiversity loss and soil degradation, for instance. And in one research work a few years ago, the economist Pavan Sukhdev looked at the GDP of the poor in India and established that, in fact, 80% of their GDP depends on what we call biodiversity and natural resources. Yet we are starting to feel the seismic shift taking place all around us, in some instances in the wrong direction, but I believe in more and more instances in the right direction. Consider, for example, the fact that more and more countries are making new, bold commitments to expand access to energy, and in doing so, increasingly relying on renewable energy. This will be a vital lever to tackle poverty, creating decent green jobs and livelihoods while driving down carbon emissions, which is why we in UNDP are also committing ourselves in the next 4 years to contribute to creating access to clean energy for 500 million people across the world. Dear friends, in every corner of the globe, the United Nations with our teams is hard at work, alongside communities, governments, people who want to change the world for the better by the choices they can make and exercise, helping to build forward better from this devastating pandemic. It centers on the principle of ending poverty and shaping a future that will balance the needs of both people and planet. This is the most direct route out of this storm towards that fairer and more sustainable future for all that we so often invoke, that we strive for, and that I think we all agree is the only way forward. Thank you. And Joy, back to you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Steiner, for those reflections. The power of choices. Choices matter. What we do going from here in dealing with the pandemic can take us on a journey towards sustainable development, or the reverse. Thank you for your solutions-leaning approach and the reminder that it is possible to end poverty, especially if we focus on that which we should, interesting ideas, the GDP of the poor, and that being a compass to take us in a direction where we start to focus on biodiversity, natural resources, creating green jobs, and that important point you made around UNDP's pledge to create jobs to the tune of at least 500 million. Thank you so much for that. Let's now turn to deliberation on the situation of global poverty in the world. Mr. Steiner has aptly located how climate change and the destruction of the environment are making the lives of the most vulnerable even more difficult. The COVID-19 pandemic has exacerbated this, with those who are consistently, even generationally, lacking access to public goods and services, quality healthcare systems, and strong and social protection being the hardest hit. This same cohort is also at the front lines of the climate emergency. They tend to be pushed to live in the most polluted, disaster-prone environments. Let's hear some of these voices, see the situation of struggle, but also their grit. Our first video is from Barclay Owen from the Central African Republic. Let us listen to his story of survival for his family and also of protecting his environment.
En Centrafrique comme dans beaucoup de pays, tout le monde ne peut pas se permettre de vivre dans de bons endroits. Les plus pauvres surtout sont obligés de s'installer dans des lieux instables, inondables, dangereux ou pollués. Ils vivent en première ligne de l'impact du changement climatique, conduisant à la perte de moyens de subsistance et à l'aggravation de la pauvreté. Barclay, ramasseur des ordures, sa femme Cindy et leurs 3 enfants s'étaient résignés à vivre dans un quartier dangereux. Un lieu où, avec une grande régularité, les groupes rebelles et d'autodéfense se tirent dessus. Barclay avait été soulagé de pouvoir s'en éloigner pour s'installer aux abords de l'Ubangi. Il a trouvé une chambre à louer pour y mettre sa famille en sécurité, et puis les inondations l'en ont chassé. C'est vrai que des inondations étaient prévisibles, mais l'ampleur du désastre cette fois-ci montrait des signes tangibles du dérèglement climatique. Certains plus informés expliquent le phénomène par plusieurs causes cumulées qui se résument à une maltraitance sans foi ni loi de la nature. La coupe du bois sans retenue fragilise les équilibres naturels. Tous les jours, des arbres centenaires couchés sur de grands camions, des convois sans fin quittent le pays. Les fleuves et les rivières sont aussi malmenés, détournés de leur lit naturel pour irriguer les exploitations d'or et de diamants, souillées par les produits chimiques utilisés dans l'extraction minière. Poissons, insectes et autres petits animaux meurent en silence. Dérèglement climatique, cupidité des hommes, ce n'est pas la littérature. Barclay et sa famille font face aux conséquences de ces maux qui dégradent la planète et divisent l'humanité.
Yeso asi bungaliti itarati kangalege na umgo tinguti bali. Menguso asara alondo langangu klo mingi asara si iling bibeni pepe. Nguni alindati dati na loro iswa me ngeti nga na keta kungbati inga menin doso iling biti goda pepe. Ingba imulege iki na gbe vakati so na bageti Fatima lasi iki langoda.
À 27 ans, Barclay est un travailleur infatigable. Avec son chariot, il sillonne tous les jours les quartiers de Bangui pour ramasser les ordures. Son travail est capital, mais il se retrouve au point de départ. Il a encore de la chance, pense-t-il.
Ambena sewa so ala ling bembeni pepe ala ingando so la petit godapa ala ngba ti lango na gbeti bash ti kumo boko tazo menangangu ti tereti veni la si isara keta kwa ti tene iso asewati ti tene iso asewati ngana kete ti bikiti so isara mingi tambeni a itati so la ngba ti bapasi na tonso lani yeti ngangu asi na yati ndoso kwa ekeda ma inga mbeni pepe yeso ipeti sara lasi inga na kete ateneso itene sanglingbe tiso na yati yeso kwa isara.
Barclay continue son activité, contribuant à sa mesure à l'assainissement de son environnement. Comme Barclay, des millions de familles vivent le même sort. Ils s'adaptent, s'acharnent, résistent en gardant la tête haute. toujours à la lisière de la survie, faisant tout pour que l'avenir de leurs enfants soit différent de leur vie d'aujourd'hui. Leur expérience, leur compréhension des réalités vécues ne sont que trop rarement partagées. Cette connaissance pourrait pourtant éclairer nos réflexions et nos décisions sur la construction d'un monde plus juste, doté d'une économie respectueuse de l'homme et de la terre.
Un travailleur infatigable. Merci beaucoup.
A worker who works tirelessly. Thank you very much, Barclay, from the Central African Republic.
Humanity's exploitation of both people and planet. Thank you, Barclay, for sharing your story. I now invite you to go with me to the Appalachian Mountains, here in the United States. A longtime environmental activist, Jerry Scardo, shares with us a crucial message about the impacts of coal mining in her region. Let's take a look.
Jerry Scardo. This report is from the Central Appalachian Mountains. It is about the broken seasons, flooding events, and what activists and environmental groups are doing. We are talking primarily about the coalfield region, whose economy has been mainly dependent on mining and is now left with vast abandoned mine lands. Here, the impacts of the mountaintop removal mining on water, biodiversity, and forest productivity has been found to be pervasive and irreversible. This region has been fracked and gridded for gas production. We are dealing with the impact of climate change on our environment. The coal mined here and mined around the world is burned to fuel power plants that generate electricity. Burning coal is one of the primary sources of carbon dioxide, which is a major greenhouse gas. It is urgent that the energy for electricity and transportation be switched from fossil fuels to renewable energy. With climate change, the Appalachian Spring, the gentle warming of the earth moving slowly from heavy frost to the morning dew is no more. With the broken seasons, we're observing crashing animal populations, the turtles, the flying insects, birds, and more. Warmer air carries more water, so now the Appalachians face damage from flooding. The rain often is very heavy and in shorter time period. In nearby Hurley, Hurricane Ida brought rain of about 6 to 7 inches. Within a half an hour, homes, vehicles, driveways, and streets were washing away. In our town, basements and streets flood because of the heavy rain and the impact of mining. Repairing disaster damage such as replacing home contents, removing fallen trees, driveway and bridge work costs hundreds and up to thousands of dollars, and is becoming more frequent. These costs are prohibitive for people who already are financially strapped. We have several communities in a town in flood zones. People live in trailers, and most of the middle class have no funds to relocate. Our population was about 28,000 in 1981. Now it's less than 14,000. Greener and more diversified jobs are not coming to our area because the region has been left behind by the government and by the mining industry. As individuals, environmental organizations, and communities, we are trying to reduce environmental impact and raise awareness about climate change. Activists are informing the public that the UN has issued the Code Red warning for humanity because of climate change. And we are informing others what to do, such as cutting out waste, food waste, energy waste, and more. Several people and organizations have been hard at work to get legislation passed But we are left with abandoned coal fields that need reclamation, a decline in population, and new challenges. We need broader investment and support going towards the region. The interventions needed on climate change depend on getting more climate champions into governments here and around the world. Community and individuals alone cannot overcome the challenges of climate change and a declining economy.
Thank you very much, Jerry, for calling our attention to the devastating impacts of mountaintop mining in the Appalachian region. We've heard of broken seasons, crashing animal populations, human population displacement, and indeed we've seen a region left behind. We hear you on the urgency to protect the environment and biodiversity, and on investing in a green transition, especially in the areas that are most left behind. This reminds us that climate change affects everyone and particularly increases the vulnerability of those living in persistent poverty. Thank you, Jerry. We're now at the stage of our first dialogue, and I'm joined by Lenin Rahman, founder of MATI, a Bangladeshi NGO working to eradicate poverty through people's empowerment. We're also joined by Kirsten Stendhal, co-manager of Poverty Environment Action at the United Nations Environment Programme. Together, we will reflect on how persistent poverty relates to and is amplified by the climate crisis. In both messages sent by Barclay and Jerry, we understand that climate change and degraded environments are forcing people to leave their homes, and that those who do not have enough resources are sometimes pushed to remain in the most unsafe places. So Lennon, I'm coming to you now to ask, what has been your experience working with communities, rural communities, experiencing climate change in Bangladesh? And how does climate change affect the lives, especially of children? Lennon.
Thank you very much. Climate change is visible in Bangladesh in different areas. The biggest delta land in the world, Bangladesh, with thousands of rivers and canals, climate change has several phases. In the southern part, we have small, tiny islands. In the middle part, we have riverbanks areas, urban areas with high population and migration as a devastating issue for environmental degradation. As a grassroots organization, we experience the struggle of people to cope with weather patterns, heavy rain, flash flood, waterlogging, and dryness. And we all know those who are living in poverty are most affected in their daily life. Adaptation or mitigation projects which are running in Bangladesh are not enough, and it doesn't actually meet the expectation of people living in poverty. A nationwide research work conducted by ATD and Oxford University together with MATI, we met children in different parts of Bangladesh to find out their opinion about how they react with dimension of poverty, especially environmental degradation. Children experience climate change and environmental degradation with an emotional feeling. In urban area, environmental degradation is quite alarming in Bangladesh. For children, experiencing poverty, hunger, and on the top of it now, changing environment is a pure stress. It's a mental stress, which lead to a uncertainty, anxiety, and it's affect actually their body and mind. In this hopeless situation, children have a kind of fear. It's affect in concentration in daily life, like education or socialization. So it's a tragic future for the children we are leading to. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lennon, for those reflections. You speak about pure stress and remind us about anxiety, uncertainty, and the need to pay special attention to how this is playing out for children in particular. Kirsten, I'm coming to you next. Your work is on the nexus between poverty and the environment. What has it told you about the ways in which communities living in poverty cope with the impacts of climate change? Kirsten.
Thank you very much, Joy, and hello to everyone, and such a pleasure to be here with you today. As we have heard, and as we have seen in the very, very powerful videos that we have been watching during this event, conflicts, climate change, and environmental degradation are threatening and have been threatening the livelihoods of poor communities for a long time. And now their lives are being further hardened by COVID. And as we see the sudden onset weather events caused by climate change, such as flooding, forest fires, and storms and drought, we can also now witness the slow onset events that lead to desertification, sea level rise, rain pattern shifts, and loss of biodiversity. Poor communities are more vulnerable to climate change impacts and climate-related hazards because of their economic reliance on climate-sensitive sectors such as subsistence farming, fisheries, and tourism. So when land and sea increasingly fails to provide for their livelihoods, people living in poverty are forced to seek out more livable places. A recent World Bank report shows that climate change is a powerful driver of internal migration of poor communities and could drive 216 million people to migrate within their own countries by 2050. In terms of solutions, science and experience from past practice tell us that protecting biological diversity and using nature-based solutions are key strategies for mitigating and adapting to the impacts of climate change. This applies to all communities, but especially to the poor and vulnerable. Increasing the resilience of poor communities through nature-based solutions involves the protection and restoration of ecosystems, and I would like to remind us all that we have entered the decade of ecosystems restoration. It entails the sustainable management of aquatic systems and working lands, such as croplands or timberlands, but it can also be the creation of novel ecosystems in and around cities. Many of our current efforts in the international community, in UNEP, working with stakeholders, placing women at in the center of all our efforts to assist communities in this rapidly changing reality will involve capacity building and training on nature-based solutions so that we achieve more resilient communities. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kirsten, for reminding us about the solutions that are sort of multifaceted precisely because of how it manifests itself. You've spoken about internal migration as a dynamic that we have to pay attention to, as well as the need to take action in this decade of ecosystem restoration. Well, interestingly, also you spoke about women and the need to pay attention to that. So to both of you now, clearly climate action and poverty eradication must be tackled together. What types of investments and commitments are needed to reach those who have been left behind? Let me come to you, Kirsten, just to pick a few more ideas, and then we'll go to Lennon.
Thank you very much, Joy. Let me tackle this from a collaboration perspective as well. So it's clear that in order to save lives and restore livelihoods, we need different timelines of action. We need immediate emergency responses, providing shelter and food to those who are acutely affected by crisis. And when we devise such remedial action, multilateral cooperation is key within the UN system, with and among non-state actors. At the same time, we have to stick to working on the long-term solutions within the ongoing development agenda, implementing the Paris Agreement, investing in the implementation of the tools and mechanisms that this requires, developing and committing to inclusive growth. While the impact of climate change is speeding up and together with COVID is threatening progress towards the SDGs, it also makes their achievement all the more urgent. Achieving the SDGs will provide resilience to climate change, to environmental degradation and future pandemics, and it will keep governments focused not only on growth, but also on inclusion, equity, and sustainability. UNEP's and UNDP's joint Poverty Environment Action for SDGs, where I work, is doing just that. We are working with countries to deepen and broaden poverty environment mainstreaming and aligning finance and investment within these countries with poverty, environment, and climate objectives. And I feel confident to say that governments and businesses are slowly but surely heeding the call to formulate the kinds of transitions that we need to build healthier, more resilient, and more sustainable societies. It is fair to say that COVID has been a wake-up call. Again, I come back to collaboration. Let me emphasize that this transformative change will only happen through inclusive action, through multi-stakeholder and multilateral cooperation. And again, coming back to keeping women in the center of our efforts. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kirsten, for those reflections, including on the important work that you're doing that will move us in the right direction. Collaboration, the way to go. What types of investments and commitments are needed? Lennon, let's hear from you from that side in Bangladesh.
Can you listen to me?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
Yes, we hear you.
Yes. In Bangladesh context, we have multi problems here in Bangladesh. We have diversified areas and diversified problems. We think investments should be long-term, what also Casting said. Vice versa, commitment as well. Because if we see in Bangladesh context, donor side and government side, commitment to the people would be honest. If it would be honest, then I think the first step would be the participation of the people and participation to gather knowledge from the people. I mean, people who are living in different parts of the world, different parts of Bangladesh has to be included. It sounds maybe old school subject, participation, but we are discussing this since many, many years in the NGO scenario, also in international partners. But in the reality, actually, the participation is not taking place in Bangladesh. For a real participation, one needs to come out from his comfort zone. I mean, the people who are policymakers or also donors, if they sit on the air-conditioned office and have a heavy car, which can only reach a good road, you cannot reach the people. The places the people are left behind. And for example, in Bangladesh context, these are the people living in small island, farmers who are living in the riverbank areas. It's a day-long journey, sometimes with boat or by feet. We have to reach those people. So my opinion, if we want to change the business as usual, we need to leave the comfort zone. Only then we can realize the practical contribution and practical condition of the people. And only then the investment can be effective, I think. Thank you.
Very much. Thank you very much, Lennon, for that really tough reminder that to talk about inclusion and to really have an impact, we must be intentional about reaching the people. So we talk about participation and inclusion and all of this, in our ways of working, we must get to where they are. I think this is the main point you're making, which is very welcome and is very well taken. Thank you very much, both to you, Lennon, and to Kirsten. So we now move on to our next segment of the commemoration of the International Day for the Eradication of Poverty, where we deep dive on what building forward together actually means. When we talk about building forward together through community-led initiatives, what do we mean? In this conversation, we search for putting dignity at the heart of action. So rather than building back better, the mantra that has been adopted for pandemic response, people living in extreme poverty are saying they do not wish to return to the past, nor do they wish to build back what was before. Instead, they're calling for a build forward together, transforming our relationship with nature, dismantling structures of discrimination that disadvantage people in poverty, and building on the moral and legal framework of human rights that places human dignity at the heart of policy and action. How do we do this? Let us go to La Bise in France's Jura Mountains. Here, an old mill was turned into a family vacation center for those living in poverty who would never afford to go on vacation and whose children were often placed in foster care. This is a powerful message of respect for people, respect for planet, but also ensuring families are reunited. So let us voyage into the Jura Mountains.
Pour moi, les vacances, le repos, et passer du temps avec mon fils. C'est surtout ça. Sur Paris, j'ai pas beaucoup l'occasion de passer du temps avec lui. Donc c'est vrai qu'ici, ça m'a donné l'occasion d'apprendre à le connaître un peu plus. Changer de lieu, voir autre chose, pas se confiner à 3 morceaux de béton et à 4 brins d'herbe qui se battent en duel en bas du bâtiment, quoi.
C'est blindé de cavernes, c'est blindé de grottes.
La Bise, c'est un ancien moulin depuis plus de 40 ans. C'est une maison datée des quarts mondes qui a été achetée pour devenir un lieu de vacances pour des familles qui ont la vie très difficile et qui ont besoin d'un endroit aussi beau que la Bise, et puis surtout de l'accueil qu'on peut y proposer, qu'on cherche très chaleureux, très familial, sans aucun jugement, sans aucune condescendance. Qu'on y soit en fait une chance les uns pour les autres. C'est-à-dire qu'on a aussi tout un réseau d'amis de la Bise qui viennent pendant les séjours proposer un atelier, une balade, tout simplement boire un café pour rencontrer les vacanciers.
Je pense que ça nous fait redevenir humains au sens j'ai le droit, autant que les autres en fait, à vivre ça, à aller me baigner, à vivre un petit moment de vacances, à voir mes enfants dans un cadre agréable et accueillant. C'est ça la vraie vie, c'est de vivre aussi au milieu de cette terre qui nous fait grandir.
Bah, c'est très bien. On voit des petites choses merveilleuses qu'on ne peut pas voir à Versailles, comme des montagnes. On peut aussi voir des petits animaux mignons comme les lapins, les veaux que j'ai vus ce matin. Et on mange tous ensemble, comme si on était une grande famille.
On peut être une chance les uns pour les autres et c'est vraiment ce qu'on vit ici. Et ça c'est possible notamment parce qu'on est à la campagne, avec un grand jardin, avec autour des amis qui vivent du travail de la terre, de leurs mains. Et dans ce contexte-là, on a toujours besoin les uns des autres. Regarde Yann, la récolte de ton fils.
Ça c'est toi qui as pris Cyril, des courgettes?
Ça crée des liens. Après ça donne des idées, comment pour cultiver la terre.
Tout est lié, enfin, prendre soin de la nature et prendre soin des hommes, on ne peut pas faire l'un sans l'autre, on fait partie de cette planète est en nous.
On a découvert un autre monde, le monde de la campagne. Moi je ne savais pas que c'était comme ça. Le jardin avec toutes les sortes de fruits et légumes.
C'est intéressant de voir comment tu les récoltes, comment c'est des arbres ou des petits arbustes ou dans le sol ou dans la hauteur. En vrai, ici c'est pour se cultiver et tout.
Il n'y a pas que cultiver la terre, il y a aussi le mental.
Non, genre la tête, genre.
Ouais, Kada, il dessine bien. Ça crée au sein de son intériorité une plus grande confiance en soi. Et ça, je pense que c'est très important dans le milieu familial quand c'est compliqué. Redevenir un peu humain et pas juste un numéro ou un quota de pauvreté ou un moins que 500 € par mois.
C'est des petites choses pour des grands projets de société. Il y a de la misère et ce qui nous rassemble, c'est qu'on veut éradiquer totalement la misère.
Souvent on dit que c'est une sorte de laboratoire de la société dont on rêve, où même si on vient de milieux différents, on peut vivre ensemble, on peut se comprendre et on peut passer des bons moments ensemble.
C'est des moments inoubliables. Ça me donne envie de revenir encore et encore.
Franchement, j'ai jamais passé d'aussi belles vacances que celle-ci dans un endroit pareil.
Les 9 jours de vacances, vraiment, ça m'a fait beaucoup de bien. Ça fait 20 ans que je n'ai pas été en vacances. 9 jours en 20 ans, c'est déjà pas mal quand même, non?
Je kiffe cet endroit.
Wow, wow. L'histoire de la bise au Jura, nous rappelons que la pauvreté est partout.
The story of la bise in Jura reminds us that poverty is everywhere, but also the reality that poverty is contextual.
To care for the vulnerable, and doing so in harmony with family values, but also with nature. So thank you very much for those initiatives as well that take care of poverty in that context. And now we go to our last video message, this time from a powerful woman farmer and community leader, Ana Lucia Santos da Silva from Brazil. She talks to us about the impact of droughts in her area and how she organizes women in her community to make their voices heard. Let's hear from Ana Lucia.
Sou agricultora e a minha atuação é como liderança comunitária. Aqui na região de Massaroca, no semiárido brasileiro, especificamente para as comunidades rurais, as famílias elas sofrem bastante, né, com a seca. A seca é um fenômeno natural que acontece todo ano, né, por conta das chuvas irregulares. Então isso dificulta a nossa vida aqui nas comunidades, porque sem água a gente não pode produzir, a gente não pode criar o animal, a gente não pode plantar. O desmatamento, né, é uma coisa que vem contribuindo muito para as mudanças climáticas. A pandemia ela, né, teve vários efeitos, com o aumento dos insumos, né, então isso dificultou a nossa produção, dificultou a comercialização, porque a gente não estava tendo contato, né, com as pessoas, com os empreendimentos, então isso teve, né, um agravamento muito grande, porque o pouco que a gente produzia não tinha como vender, mas o importante é que a gente também estava tendo para consumir. Com um pouco da água, né, que a gente tem aqui nas comunidades, a gente busca, né, tá produzindo um quintalzinho de uma horta, criando uma galinha, criando um bode. Então são animais que consomem pouca água, né, e culturas que exigem pouca água também. Atualmente venho exercendo o papel de liderança como presidente, né, do Comitê de Associações aqui da região de Massaroca, que é composto por 12 associações comunitárias, né, dessas comunidades. Então o papel da gente aqui é articular junto aos parceiros, né, as entidades não governamentais, a Igreja Católica, todos os parceiros que venham acreditando que essa região a gente pode fazer algo por ela, né? Então a gente trabalha aí na preparação de reuniões, né, nas articulações em busca de políticas públicas voltadas para essa região, no embasamento, né, na formação das companheiras, né, das mulheres, que hoje a gente percebe o empoderamento. O papel das mulheres, né, nosso papel aqui na região é acreditar, lutar, né, pelo bem comum, buscar, lutando por dias melhores, pelo desenvolvimento da região, né, quebrando paradigmas, contra o machismo, né? Buscando realmente empoderar outras companheiras, né? Eu acredito no potencial de muitas mulheres, as que estão na luta em seus territórios. Eu sonho com um mundo mais justo, igualitário, onde todos os povos tenham seus direitos garantidos pela preservação do nosso meio ambiente, né, do nosso planeta, para que ele seja visto com outros olhos e que a erradicação da pobreza ela aconteça para todas as nações.
Ana Lucia, muito obrigada. Thank you for your work and for inspiring us. Your work empowering women is leading the way in creating impactful change. Thank you very much. Now on to our second dialogue, where we explore more solutions of hope. And joining me for this is Olivier Richard from the Permanent Mission of France to the United Nations here in New York, and Glendy Rosales from a social enterprise called Trabajar y Aprender Juntos in Guatemala. Her enterprise helps those unemployed and working in the informal sector to receive training and have a dignified work while strengthening social ties. Let's start with you, Glendy. The different messages today highlight the need for a better future for both people and planet. So how is your work in Guatemala doing this? Glendy. The floor is yours, Glendy.
Buenos días. Muy buenos días. Mi nombre es Glendy Rosales. Yo vivo en una comunidad de zona 3 en Ciudad de Guatemala. Vivo alrededor del basurero de zona 3. Es el basurero más grande de la ciudad. Y nosotras, bueno, digo nosotras porque somos un grupo de personas que nos denominamos TAG, que significa trabajar y aprender juntas. Nosotras estamos en este proyecto desde hace 10 años y comenzó como un proyecto piloto en 2009.
It began as a pilot project back in 2009 to know what we could do around where we work, which is a wasteland. There's very little recycling. There's a very low offer of employment. It depends. It's very difficult to find a job depending on your age, your gender, where you live, low qualification. So our group tries to offer an opportunity for employment to different people. At the beginning, we were only 10 people from different places in the city. These are called red zones with high violence rates. We didn't know what we could do. We were based on 4 things: solidarity, inclusion, respect, and training. Those are things that you won't see being offered in any regular job placement. Solidarity among all of us so we can help each other. This is a recycling project. We take things such as paper waste, plastic bottles, and we do craft work so we can create a better economic situations for the participants. With these 4 bases, 4 things were based upon that we mentioned before. We all support one another, and we offer the respect that everyone deserves, just for being people. Things that in a regular job you are not going to be offered, because it's not possible. They demand experience, they demand that you know how to work, and they just want to exploit you. We make this group. We come from different areas, as I mentioned before. When we began, we didn't know what we could do, but we have been able to move forward little by little. We now have a slightly bigger team. We have included more people in our project. We have been able to create new crafts. We have a base that is called mutual benefit or common benefit. 10% of all the sales all of this 10% is split among the very same crafters equally. So that means that the person who sold the less still has a chance to earn a little bit more.
Thank you very much indeed, Glendy, for sharing your work with us and the important initiatives you're taking to support the community. Let me now move to you, Olivier. France has played a major role in the adoption of the Paris Agreement in 2015. How can we ensure that development goals and climate-related goals are pursued simultaneously, and that climate action is linked to poverty eradication? How can governments support local initiatives such as the ones we saw in France and in Guatemala? Olivier.
Merci beaucoup, Joy. Tout d'abord, bonjour à tout le monde.
Thank you very much, Joy. So first of all, I'd like to thank the organizers of this event, and France is very honored to be associated with this event. Thank you for having chosen us. And I'd also like to express my admiration to all of the panelists and the testimony that we've heard today. So to answer your question, I think that there are three pitfalls we need to avoid. The first pitfall is to think that we can combat poverty, and that once we will have resolved that problem, be able to take on the problem of climate change and the loss of biodiversity. That would be a poor choice, because we can see that it's already the most poor and vulnerable people who are the most affected by climate change. So we can't wait to tackle one problem after the other. And all experts tell us that if we don't change our way of producing and consuming in a few years, it will be too late. And that a vicious circle of environmental degradation will not be able to be broken. And that will create a catastrophic situation for future generations. The second pitfall that we need to avoid is to avoid working separately in silos in order to combat environmental degradation and to promote biodiversity without taking into account socioeconomic factors. That's why we need to work together with the specialists in order to work together. The third pitfall to avoid is to think that only certain countries and only certain socioeconomic categories and only certain sectors need to change the way that they act. We all need to change the way that we produce and the way that we consume, including in wealthy countries and including privileged peoples. Especially those are the people who need to change the most. So it is that's the fight that we are moving forward with at the United Nations in order to avoid these pitfalls. Thank you. Thank you very much, Olivier, for sharing your thoughts with us.
Both of you, the same question. What gives you hope? What gives you hope for a just and better future in which Barclay, our person from Central African Republic, Jerry, and Ana Lucia, the videos we've seen, the testimonials, what gives you hope that they can finally live the lives they want? I'll start with you, Olivier.
Merci beaucoup, Joy. Eh bien, déjà, je voudrais dire que ces témoignages, c'est une source d'inspiration, d'admiration pour nous. Quand je vois leur résilience, leur courage, eh bien, ça me donne de l'espoir parce que justement, ils continuent à se battre. Ils nous donnent l'exemple. En fait, ici, aux Nations Unies, on ne doit pas perdre de vue ce qui se passe dans l'ensemble du monde. Et je pense qu'on devrait avoir beaucoup plus d'événements comme celui offert par ATD Quart-Monde aujourd'hui. Je pense que nous, personnes travaillons à New York, dans les sièges des Nations Unies, on devrait être davantage en contact effectivement avec l'ensemble des citoyens, tout d'abord pour les écouter et pour expliquer aussi ce qu'on essaye de faire ici. Alors on essaye de créer de nouveaux mécanismes pour essayer de faire plus. Je peux vous donner un exemple là de cette semaine, c'est la création d'un rapporteur sur la protection des droits humains face au changement climatique. Et donc, ça fait le lien aussi avec les droits de l'homme. Le droit à avoir un environnement sain fait partie des droits de l'homme et nous allons maintenant avoir un rapporteur qui va examiner, qui va faire des missions, qui va être un autre témoin, un autre ambassadeur de la pauvreté dans le monde et qui viendra faire rapport à Genève, à New York, etc. Donc, ce sont ces initiatives, cette bonne volonté, ces engagements qui me donnent espoir.
Merci beaucoup. Glendy, what gives you...
Thank you very much.
Pues la esperanza de...
I think that for me, hope is that some years ago we didn't know so many things concerning economy, and as me and my colleagues learn, we get to this experience of life to way more people. We have created awareness, and we have shown people that we can do good things, taking the rubbish, taking things that other people do not use. We live in completely different worlds. So I think that sharing this knowledge that we have to the others, it is hope. And I'm talking from our point of view. And we do it consciously and unconsciously. It is not like a form that I learned so many years ago and then I forgot it. No, I do apply it every single day. I apply it when I speak with people, with my friends, and this gives me hope that we can learn everything. We can learn to be friendly with the planet. We can learn to have a minimal life, to consume less, to stop harming the planet. For example, if we throw rubbish to the street, it is harming the planet. To be able to tell people that there's a problem and we need to think how to fix it. And even if we do really small actions, these little actions are going to be a big movement. It happens with the domino game. And we can do a lot of things together. Even if we think that we do little actions, we can make a big change. Thank you.
For those reflections, I think both yourself and Olivier have stressed this idea that it is possible to change how we live, how we act, how we produce, how we consume, how we value different products. And I recall, takes us back to that key point the UNDP administrator made at the start, which is that choices matter. So thank you so much for sort of like closing that part off on a hopeful note. To conclude this rich conversation, I invite Isabelle Perrin General Director of the international movement ATD Fourth World, and to Olivier Descouter, Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights. Isabel and Olivier, we have seen throughout the event that respecting the rights and dignity of people is closely related to respecting the earth and our environment. So how can we work towards a future that is fair and just for everyone, especially those struggling the most? Let's start with you, Isabel.
Merci, Joy.
Thank you very much, Joy. Actually, I would like to answer your question by asking another question. Are we going to learn with those who suffer the most to build a world for everybody, a just world that is really for everybody and that thinks about future generations? Because actually those who think in the most difficult living conditions are not just victims. They are first and foremost actors for change, actors for building a new world, and they are often ignored, and it's true that they are the ones who are suffer the most of the consequences of of what we don't do, of the promises that we don't keep, the way that we've decided that we had the right to use the earth and exploit the earth and the people. In the last few days, I met families that live around here in the around Paris, that live in slums in awful conditions, like 1 billion people who on the world, that their life is starved, their health is weaker, the links that they have with others are hampered, and the children who are their whole life don't grow up well because they have lead in the soil. So the people who live in misery show us that the dimensions of our human catastrophe, but they act, they resist, they take charge for the thing that we don't take in charge for, and for the this entire commemoration that showed us how they take charge of their environment around themselves, and how they try to make their life possible in their environment. In fact, they go further than that. Those who live in misery in the most forgotten parts of the world, they take care of one another, and we can say that they give shape to and give reality to the ambition of the international community gave itself in 2015, when they gave a special rate, to this diminishing poverty throughout the world, so that there are no one left behind, and decided to commit to reach those who are the most, remote and the most abandoned. But we should not, forget, that those who are, people who live in the silence first in the world are the people who live in poverty. Those are the people who live in this condition, and that they promote mostly the issue of having no one left behind. So are we going to make room for them? How are we going to make room in all the places where we think about the future? How are we going to make room for them so that they can share their experience and their knowledge? I'm thinking about families that have found refuge in a polluted area, and they said, we won't leave until we have found solutions for those of us who are the most tired. And they showed us, how all of our programs and all of our actions must be based on the concern, for the most excluded people and those who are the most remote or who are not around us. I would like to link participation and human commitment. We know parents who go to healthcare centers with a young child, who's suffering from hunger and malnutrition and denutrition, and you can feel that that people are looking at them, with some look of reproach, that they feel shame, but because they can't provide for their children. Because at the same time, we know that all the means to give a confidence, a pride in people and solidarity, this exists, and the thing could be different. So making sure that participation of people in the community and the poor families in the program and the mechanism for implementation of the program is key, and we should go even further. It should be at the heart of all of our programs. We need to have men and women who are available, who welcome them, to meet with them, who take some risk to go and meet and reach those who are the most remote. Let's go and try to get their participation, their involvement, those who are the most remote people, far spaces for dialogue and consultation and discussion. And of course, beyond the programs, and citizens throughout the world should be living in solidarity with the people who are most forgotten. And this human engagement should be supported. Since the beginning of the health crisis, the COVID crisis, we've seen throughout the world, healthcare people, caregivers to fight, to serve people, and they are very tired. They're not counting their hours of work, that give us confidence and hope, to save life. They committed themselves completely. And, misery is also a question of life and death for those who live in misery. So therefore, putting an end requires mobilization on the same scale, an unprecedented mobilization, and human commitment that are very consequential, that we must support. In conclusion, I would just like to say that we are going through a dark period for the world, but we should be hopeful, because people are not hopeless. They believe in themselves, they believe in their children, they believe in human beings, even though they know we have our faults. So I would like to say to the youth of the world who are work for the planet, who are committed, who are getting involved for the planet, and who are right. I say, work hand in hand with those who fight for against misery, and then you're going to propose real change, and nothing can stop you. Thank you, Joy. Thank you very much, Isabel.
Energy and the drive and the solutions-oriented perspectives you're sharing with us around solidarity, pride, how the young people are taking action. This idea that the real people at the front lines of poverty are the poor themselves, but they're not sitting there waiting. They're taking their hands up and doing something about it. This also gives us hope. Let's come to you, Mr. Scooter, to give us your reflections on the same question. How can we work towards a future that is fair and just for everyone, especially those struggling the most?
Thank you very much indeed, Joy. And let me first of all thank you for organizing this panel together with UNDP and ATD Fourth World, and for allowing me to speak after the very moving words of Isabelle Perrin. What Isabelle told us very simply is that the real experts on how to support a way out of the obstacles we face is by listening to people in poverty. And that is also true as we face the most important challenge of today, which is to combine the fight against poverty with the protection of the planet and the mitigation of climate change and biodiversity loss. People in poverty are the real experts on how to support ecosystems. They know what it means to save water, to save energy, to cultivate soils without chemical inputs. They know what it means to reuse and to repair, and they know what it means to help one another in order to strengthen social resilience. And what I would like to do in just a couple of minutes is to emphasize that there's no need to choose between investing in social protection or investing in greening the economy, encouraging reasonable consumption or improving livelihoods by raising the incomes of people in poverty, designing a post-growth economy or stimulating growth to finance public services and social protection to the population. There is no need to choose between the green transition and social justice. These oppositions are a myth. And I'd like to emphasize why today we should bring the two together, and why the reconstructing agenda is really one that should take into account the two concerns. First, we heard many testimonies from Bangladesh, from the Appalachian region, from Ana Luisa in Masaroca in Brazil, many testimonies showing that people in poverty are the most affected by climate change and biodiversity loss because they rely on the ecosystems for their livelihoods, as small-scale farmers, as artisanal fishers, as indigenous groups that depend on the forests, and because it is poor people who live in the areas that are regularly flooded, facing landslides, and sometimes may even have to migrate from the places where they reside, as Kirstine Stendhal from UN Environment has reminded us. So that's the first reason why the two cannot be dissociated. The second reason is there are a number of triple dividend measures that in areas such as energy, food, transport, building can at the same time mitigate environmental impacts, but also create jobs for people with low levels of qualification and ensure that low-income households have access to the basic goods and services that allow to lead a decent life. These measures exist, and it is in these measures that we must invest. For example, if you invest in public transportation, you reduce pollution from individual cars, but you also create jobs for infrastructure building and to man the trains and the buses and the trams, and you ensure that the right to mobility will be enjoyed also by low-income households. Similarly, if you refurbish buildings, you save energy and you reduce the environmental impacts of heating buildings, but at the same time, you create jobs in the construction sector and you allow families to have lower energy bills. So that's the second reason why the two agendas must be brought together. And the third reason, very simply, is that inequality is an obstacle to the ecological transformation we urgently need, for three reasons. First, in more equal societies, there is less growth, less economic growth needed to combat poverty because growth is more inclusive and more equitably shared. In more equal societies, the resources of society will go less to satisfy the desires of the rich, including the frivolous desires of the rich, and more to the needs of all, including the basic needs of people in poverty. And in more equal societies, consumption will be driven less by status competition and more by the search for decent livelihoods. So there is no need to choose between healing the planet or banishing poverty. The two are mutually supportive. Indeed, they are the condition of one another. And we can only succeed, I believe, by pursuing both at the same time and by seeing both as part of the same transformative agenda. That is what gives me hope, and that is why we will continue together with ATD Fourth World to fight for the two together, social justice and greening of the economy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Discuta, for that really elaborate, illustrious, deep range of reflections. I have very much enjoyed and pulled out sound bites for what I'm about to do, which is summarize what I see as the 10 big messages coming out of today's conversation. At the start, we talked about the need to listen. When you listen, you must learn. And so I'd like to attempt to give us the learnings from the conversation we've had today. The overarching framework is that there is no dichotomy. We cannot afford to create or allow ourselves to use the dichotomy between poverty on the one hand and climate action. We don't have the luxury to do that. The two are with us and the two require solutions. So if we're looking at fighting poverty, preserving our planet, tackling and fighting back on climate change, then indeed the first point is choices matter. And the choice we're making out of today's conversation is that what we do individually, what we do in communities, what we do in all our walks of life matters. And in taking that choice even forward, not only for the COVID recovery and the need for everybody to have vaccines, it's really this idea that there is a marriage between what we're trying to do, and we must tackle it full force together. The second big thing coming out of today's conversation is that we must push ahead steadfast on the global consensus to pivot away from fossil fuels and towards more sustainable solutions. That is critical. The third one is when we look at poverty and our solutions to fight poverty, we need to understand it in its real construct. And the experts are the real heroes, those ones at the front lines, fighting it every day, the Barclays and others that we saw today. And so the administrator gave us a very interesting thought, the GDP of the poor, and how looking at that takes us in a whole different direction, where we start to understand their assets, and we start to use those as a basis to create the right jobs, green jobs, and drive down carbon emissions. That's the third point. The fourth point is we need to invest in those regions that are most affected by poverty and by the climate crisis. And as we do this with a long-term view. We do this with what Mr. Diskuta spoke about as the triple dividends approach, where you understand that in doing the right thing, in investing in public transport, for example, there's 3 pieces of dividends coming in there, not just bringing down the emissions, but also creating jobs and giving that dignity to everybody. The 5th point is there are unique ways in which poverty, and in particular the climate urgency, is hitting children, and we must pay special attention to that. We heard from Bangladesh what is happening with the pure stress. How do we tackle that? It must be on our radar. The 6th point is internal migration is a huge dynamic that's with us, and we must pay attention to it and find those particular solutions that deal with this issue. 7, protecting biodiversity is critical. We must promote nature-based solutions. We heard about the decade of ecosystem restoration. We must work to preserve ecosystems and preserve social resilience, as we were told. The 8th point is women, that there is a unique way in which women are being affected by the negative impacts of both poverty and the climate emergency. We heard of interesting initiatives from Guatemala where they're empowering women to take charge, to be empowered through entrepreneurship and so on and so forth. We've heard about the idea that when it's done in one way well, it has a trickle mindset effect on the others. And so how to pay particular attention to the women issue. The 9th point, and I only have 10, is that collaboration is critical. We must bring all the parties together. Olivier told us about silos and avoiding the temptation to work in those silos. We spoke also about collaboration. Many spoke about collaboration today. And so how to ensure that even as we go away from today, it is about working together as opposed to pushing on your own. The third and final point is really about participation. Participation must be led, especially by those who understand it the most, those for whom this is a reality. Not receiving the results of charity, but designing, leading the architectural processes of thinking of solutions, leading the implementation of solutions, and letting that be the transformative change that we're making today. So with all of these 10 points, I think there's sufficient hope. There's a sufficient, in my mind, satisfaction that we've had a rich discussion. We've had an on-the-ground appreciation of the perspectives. We know it is present with us. We know the solutions are possible. And I'd like to invite you all to really take a pledge, even a personal pledge, to do your part to end poverty and to defeat the climate urgency. Thank you very much. And this brings us to the end of our conversation today. Goodbye.
Thank you very much, Joy, for a superb leadership you took on this session.
You're most welcome.
Thank you to all.
Yes, thank you to our panelists. Thank you to our participants. And have a good day.